On the night of the 22nd of January 1879, a British column marched back into a camp he had left that morning and found it gone. Not abandoned, completely gone. The tents had been torn through, the wagons had been stripped, and the ground, as far as the men could see in the dark, was covered with their own dead. By morning, the column had a story. Within weeks, so did England. The Zulu had hung the drummer boys of the 24th on butcher's hooks and cut them open while they were still alive. It is one of the most enduring legends of Isandlwana, and it is not true. You see, boy was an official army classification, not a description of every drummer, not of a youth soldier. And the drummers who died at Isandlwana were not the 11 or 12-year-old children of the legend. The records identify them as young soldiers and grown men. The youngest was 18, the oldest was in his 30s. The rumor started early, in letters home in the weeks after the battle. But the detailed eyewitness version, the one with the hooks in it, was told 50 years later by a man recalling a night so dark that witnesses said they could barely see their own hands. There is no reliable evidence that any of it happened. The tortured children are a fiction. But hold on to that picture, because the horror underneath it was real. The Zulu did open many of the bodies of the dead. This was not torture, it was part of a set of rituals meant to protect the man for the spirit of the enemy he had killed. Opening the abdomen was one element of that. There is no reliable evidence that it was done to men who were still alive. That distinction is the whole reason this episode begins here. British soldiers walked through a field of open bodies in the dark, and they told themselves a story about savages. Of course, to Western eyes and the civilized British Empire of the time, this was a stark contrast, because there was only one explanation: these are savages. But the story did a job. It explained the catastrophe is a fact about the enemy, and about what kind of creature would do such a thing. It did not require anyone to ask why their camp had no trench around it, and no wagons drawn up, and no walls of any kind. And it did not require anyone to ask where the general had been while it was overrun. Fewer than 2,000 soldiers and auxiliaries were in and around that camp, with hundreds of civilians, drivers, and camp followers besides. More than 1,300 of them were dead by the middle of the afternoon. Of course, they had modern rifles, they had artillery. They were a force armed, led and sent by the most powerful empire on earth, and they were destroyed in an afternoon by an enemy whose main weapon was a spear. And one more thing, which is the strangest of all, this was the Zulu kingdom's greatest victory over a European army. It also helped seal that kingdom's fate. Within 6 months, the Zulu army would be broken at Ulundi. Cetshwayo would be driven into hiding, and Zulu independence would be effectively finished. This is how that happened, and it does not begin in Africa. It begins with a man who did not ask permission. I am Benito, and welcome to the Jacked Historian channel. First, let's start with some background information. Where did this war come from? In the 1870s, Britain had an idea for Southern Africa. The idea was called Confederation. You take the British colonies and the Boer republics and the independent African kingdoms, and you fold them into one large, orderly British-run whole. By 1878, very little of that plan had gone smoothly. Britain had annexed the Transvaal the year before, but the larger confederation remained unbuilt and unpopular. and directly beside the Transvaal and Natal stood the independent Zulu kingdom, and in particular the Zulu army. A confederation built for British order could not easily sit beside an African state that could field tens of thousands of trained men. The man given the job of removing that obstacle was Sir Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner. On the 11th of December 1878, Frere presented King Cetshwayo with an ultimatum. The heart of it was a demand that the Zulu dismantle their entire military system, with 30 days for the principal terms. We should be careful about claiming to read Frere's mind, but the demands were so sweeping, asking a king to disband the institution his kingdom was built on, that it is very hard to believe Frere expected them to be accepted. And one fact matters more than any single term in the document. London had not authorized a war. The government in Britain did not want one. Frere issued his ultimatum, ran down his 30 days, and sent an army across the border anyway. The whole disaster, the camp, the dead, the open bodies begins here, months before a shot is fired, with a war that nobody in London had approved. But what was the objective? What each side wanted? The British plan was simple, and on paper it was sound. Send columns into Zululand, find the main Zulu army, bring it to a pitched battle and destroy it. Modern rifles against spears. In the open, the British had done this all over the world, and it had worked. Lord Chelmsford, commanding, had one real fear, and it was not defeat. The thought that he might lose barely seems to have occurred to him. His fear was that the Zulu would refuse to fight, that they would melt away in front of him, drag the war out for months and deny him his one decisive battle. Cetshwayo's aim was almost the exact opposite. His policy was defensive, absorb the invasion, stay out of Natal, and give the British no excuse, and hope the whole thing could still be talked down. That was the policy. It did not bind every Zulu commander perfectly, and later that same day a force would cross into Natal against the king's wishes and attack a mission station called Rorke's Drift. But the policy of the kingdom was to defend, not to invade. So here's the shape of it. Chelmsford spent the whole of January terrified the Zulu would not give him a battle. They gave him one, and he was not there for it. The invasion began on the 11th of January. 3 columns crossed into Zululand. Chelmsford went with the center column. More than 4,000 soldiers and auxiliaries, plus a long train of wagons, across the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift. On the 20th of January, that column made camp beneath a steep sphinx-shaped hill called Isandlwana. And here we come to the decision that everything else rests on. The camp was not laggard. The wagons were not drawn into a defensive ring. No trench or breastwork protected the tents. There was in effect no fortification of any kind. Chelmsford argued afterwards that the column was only halting briefly and that forming a proper lagger would take far too long. Now, in fairness, and this episode intends to be fair, even when fairness makes things less comfortable, there are real arguments on Chelmsford's side. His own standing orders did stress defensive precautions in the field, but the best modern historians point out those orders were really written for more permanent camps, not a short halt on the march. And many of these 100-odd wagons were not even in camp. They were out on the road hauling supplies up from Rorke's Drift. He might not have had enough wagons on the ground to form a lagger even if he had wanted to. So this is not a story about a man who broke his own rules. That is too easy, and it is contested. The charge against Chelmsford is worse than breaking a rule. The charge is that he did not think he needed one. He camped in the open, in enemy country, in front of an army he had come specifically to fight, and he did not believe that army was capable of doing anything about it. So in this context, what was the intelligence failure? On the 21st of January, a mounted reconnaissance under Major Darnell rode out to the southeast and ran into a substantial force of Zulu. Darnell looked at them, decided he might have found the main army, and made a choice. He stayed out overnight and sent back to camp asking for infantry support. He had not found the main army. There is a temptation to call that force a decoy, to say that the Zulu deliberately exposed themselves in front of Chelmsford to draw him off, but we cannot prove that. What we can say is plainer and worse. That force was not the main Zulu army, and its appearance told Chelmsford exactly what he already wanted to hear, that the main army was to the southeast and that if he moved fast he could catch it. Because while Chelmsford was looking southeast, the real Zulu army had moved in the dark into a valley called Ngwebeni. No fires, no noise, more than 20,000 men only a few miles from his camp, and the British had no idea they were there. Before dawn on the 22nd, Chelmsford divided the column. He took a large part of it southeast. The 2nd Battalion of the 24th, most of the mounted troops, and 4 of the 6 guns, after the enemy he thought he'd found. About 1,400 men remained at Isandlwana under a Colonel Pulaine. Later that morning, a Colonel Dumford rode in with several hundred more. By the time the battle opened, the British-led force in and around the camp numbered fewer than 2,000. Hidden a few miles away were more than 20,000 Zulu, and they had not planned to fight that day. The Zulu command appears to have intended to attack the following morning on the 23rd. According to later accounts, the 22nd was the day of the new moon, considered an unlucky day to begin a great undertaking. The battle opened a day early, and by accident. A mounted patrol scouting the plateau pursued a small party of Zulu toward a ridge. When the riders reached the edge of the Ngwebeni Valley, they found the main army below them. There is a small bitter footnote here. That afternoon, a partial eclipse crossed the sun, and an event astronomers could time to the minute years in advance. British reconnaissance could not find more than 20,000 men a few miles from the camp. And in this context, what was the command failure? Now we come to the most famous explanation for what happened next. It deserves to be taken seriously, it also deserves to be taken apart. The story goes like this. The firing line held at first. The Martini Henry rifle was a good weapon and the men knew how to use it. But then the cartridges started to run out, and back at the ammunition wagons, it is said, the quartermasters refused to hand out rounds to soldiers from the wrong regiment. The reserve boxes were screwed shut, and nobody could find a screwdriver to open them. And so the greatest empire on earth was defeated in the end by red tape and a missing tool. It is a perfect story, it is also a deeply misleading one. We know it is wrong because people have gone out to that battlefield and dug. A survey in the year 2000 found bent ammunition box screws and fragments of tin lining along the British firing positions, out where the soldiers actually stood. Boxes were being forced open on the line. The ammunition was reaching at least part of it. Zulu accounts describe the British still firing steadily, deep into the battle. And that famous business about the quartermaster refusing to hand out rounds comes from one officer's memory of one quartermaster, a man named Bloomfield, who did hesitate to give up his reserve. But that reserve was earmarked for Chelmsford's column out in the field. Bloomfield was following his orders, and the officer who remembered it went off and got the ammunition distributed anyway. So the honest verdict is this, and it is the only claim worth making. There is no reliable evidence that the regular infantry line collapsed because he ran out of ammunition. One important qualification remains: there was one part of the field where ammunition really was a problem. Colonel Dunford's mounted men were fighting from a dry gully of the exposed right, far from their wagons, and they carried a different carbine, which took a different cartridge from the infantry's rifles. Some of those men may well have begun to run short, and that difficulty out of the flank is most likely the grain of truth the whole grand myth grew up around. But notice what the myth does. He blames a screwdriver so that he does not have to blame a general. So let us talk about the general's men and what actually happened to them. Pulain's company were pushed out well forward of the tents. In the end, a firing line about 1,000 yards from the camp and close to a mile wide. This was not one clean decision. Companies were sent out piece by piece in answer to reports coming in, and the line just kept stretching as the threat spread. As the danger got wider, the line got wider with it. And that is the real military failure. In one sentence, they were trying to defend far too much ground with far too few men and nothing solid to fall back on behind them. For about 1 hour, it worked anyway. The volleys were disciplined. The Zulu attack in the center was stopped and pinned and could not get forward. If the whole battlefield had looked like the center, the British might have held. But it did not. The Zulu left horn swept around the British right and out in the gully. Dunford's men, under mounting pressure, in danger of being cut off and apparently running short of ammunition for their carbines, were forced to withdraw. When they fell back, the right end of the British line was suddenly open, and into that open flank came the horn of the buffalo. At that point, the line began to fall back toward the camp. Whether one order was given to do it or whether it simply came apart under the pressure, we cannot tell you, because the men who would have known were all killed. But we know what happened the instant the line broke. The rifle could no longer save them. It is a weapon of distance and order, and there was no distance and no order left. It became a close, hand-to-hand killing across the whole camp. And in that kind of fight, the Zulu army numbered more than 20,000 men, and the entire British-led force numbered fewer than 2,000. One last thing about the command. Dunford, who arrived late, outranked Pulain, who was already there. The standard account says this created a fatal muddle about who was actually in charge. Maybe it did, but even that is disputed by serious historians. The surviving evidence does not settle it. We will only say this, and keep it in your mind. The man who would end up carrying the blame for Isandlwana was one of the men who did not walk away from it. To understand how this happened, you have to put aside the picture of a spear-waving mob overwhelming brave riflemen by sheer numbers. The picture is how the British explained their defeat to themselves. It is not what they fought. The Zulu army was an institution. It was built on the Amabuto, age regiments, group of men of the same generation called up into the king's service. It was not a standing army in the European sense. The men were not sitting in barracks year-round. They had homes and cattle and fields to work. But the system could summon tens of thousands of trained, disciplined men and put them in the field fast under a clear chain of command. And it fought with a tactic, commonly described as the horns of the buffalo. The chest, the main body, goes straight at the enemy and holds him in place. The two horns sweep out wide on either side, race around his flanks, and meet behind him, so that he is surrounded before he understands what is happening. Behind the chest waits the reserve, often called the loins. It was not an improvised rush, it belonged to the military system built during the rise of the Zulu kingdom, and by 1879 it had been drilled into generations of Zulu regiments. Now think about what they did at Isandlwana. They were discovered before their commanders intended to begin the battle by an enemy patrol that stumbled onto them. And they still deployed with extraordinary speed. Across miles of broken ground, the chest fixed the British line while the horns moved around both flanks and closed. That was not luck, and it was not weight of numbers. It was a superbly drilled military machine doing the exact thing it was built to do, under bad conditions and ahead of schedule. Nor were they without firearms. The Zulu kingdom held thousands of muskets and rifles, and some were carried at Isandlwana. Most were old, and ammunition was inconsistent. And Zulu shooting played a secondary role. The battle was still decided at close quarters. But the neat image of spearmen facing rifles with no guns of their own is false, and you should set it aside. This is how the 24th Regiment died. The assegai, the spear, killed the man, but it was the maneuver that made the killing possible. When Chelmsford column came back that night, he did not dare move in the dark, so he made his exhausted men lie down and sleep among the bodies of their friends and wait for morning. More than 1,300 men of the British-led force were dead. The usual count runs to 52 officers, roughly 690 British regulars, and about 130 European colonial troops, and more than 300 African auxiliaries. But those figures are not equally reliable. The camp records were destroyed, and African casualties were never documented with the same care. Fewer than 100 Europeans escaped from the camp, perhaps only around 60. How many Africans got out is less certain still. Zulu losses are harder to establish. Estimates of the dead run from roughly 1,000 to 3,000, with many more wounded. Some who walked off the field died later beyond the reach of any count. That same evening, a few miles back at the mission station of Rorke's Drift, around 150 defenders held off some 4,000 Zulu who had crossed the river against their own king's orders. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for that defense, an extraordinary concentration of Britain's highest award for bravery in a single action. We should be clear about Rorke's Drift because he has done something strange to the memory of this war. The defense was real, and it was brave indeed, but it was also, in the cold accounting, a small action at a supply post. On the same day, the heart of an invasion column was destroyed. What Rorke's Drift did was give the British public a story they could bear to tell. It did not erase Isandlwana. It stood beside it, and then slowly in the national memory it moved in front of it. The disaster faded, the 11 medals stayed. And then came the business of deciding whose fault it was. A court of inquiry was convened 5 days after the battle, and you can see the whole thing in a single detail, what it was told to look into. Its instructions were to inquire into the loss of the camp, not the conduct of the commander, not the decision to split the force or to leave the camp unfortified or to lose an army of 20,000 men a few miles away, just the loss of the camp. He called only a handful of witnesses. Other survivors with relevant evidence were never asked to appear. And in the end, that court delivered no verdict at all. Its own proceedings record that it refrained from offering an opinion. Formally then, there was no finding. Politically, a verdict was already taking shape. And the blame settled where it was always going to settle. It settled on Colonel Dunford, the officer who had ridden in late and died on the field. Lieutenant Colonel Crelock told the inquiry that Dunford had been sent to take command of the camp, but the surviving Briton order tells Dunford only to move up to Isandlwana with his force. It does not clearly tell him to take command of anything, and historians have argued over that gap ever since. The man the blame was pinned on had been dead for 5 days and could say nothing. The people who understood this best were on the British side. The very officers sent from England to replace Chelmsford wrote privately that fall that the blame was being thrown onto Dunford and that the real object was to shield Chelmsford. And the Army's own High Command, examining the disaster months later, quietly reached the conclusion the court had been steered away from, that the true cause of Isandlwana was that the British had underestimated the fighting power of the Zulu army. Now watch how he ends for the man in charge, because the establishment could not agree what he was. By the summer, London had lost patience and sent Sir Garnet Wolseley to take the command away from him. Wolseley landed at the Cape on the 28th of June. Chelmsford fought his final victorious battle at Ulundi, the battle that broke the Zulu army, on the 4th of July. 6 days. He got his victory in, and the war more or less won before his replacement could reach him and take the army out of his hands. And so he came home with a victory attached to his name. On the 2nd of September, Queen Victoria received him. He was elevated to Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, the highest class of the order. She wrote in her journal that he looked tall, very thin, and worn, and that she found him singularly pleasing. She defended him fiercely to anyone who would listen. But her own Prime Minister did not agree with her. Benjamin Disraeli, the very man whose government had let this war happen, thought Chelmsford had been, in his word, panic-struck. And then Gladstone replaced Disraeli the following year. Chelmsford asked to be received by the Prime Minister. Gladstone refused to see him. So the establishment handed down 2 verdicts at once. The Queen gave him one of the country's highest honors. The political judgment was far colder. And underneath the argument, the quieter judgment was already settled. Chelmsford never held a field command again. No senior officer was ever court-martialed for Isandlwana. Frere, who had started the whole war without London's permission, was quietly recalled the following year, and Chelmsford was decorated for the war and finished by it in the same 12 months, given his medal and his audience with the Queen, and never trusted with soldiers in the field again. In closing, if we look back at our previous episodes, nearly 2,000 years before Isandlwana, this series told you about Kerry, where a Roman army marched into a desert against an enemy he had not bothered to understand and was destroyed. Isandlwana is the same failure in another century, an army that did not understand its enemy, an army that entered hostile country without preparing its camp against the enemy it had come to find. An army so certain of its own superiority that it divided itself in front of 20,000 men it could not even locate. 1900 years apart, rifles and artillery had replaced bows and lances and javelins. The British Empire had replaced the Roman Republic, but the certainty was the same. The absolute unshakable conviction that the enemy in front of you is not really a threat. That conviction has killed more soldiers than any weapon ever made. Next time on history's greatest military disasters, a narrow strip of water, a plan drawn up by a clever man very far away, and a landing that turned into 9 months of men dying on a beach they were never going to leave. Thank you very much for following up so far, and I will see you next time. Bye.